I was born Jewish and used to believe in God, but have since read many books that have proven God is just a figment of my imagination. People like to believe in God because it answers complicated questions, like where did the universe come from? Do worms go to heaven? And why do old ladies have blue hair? Even though I'm an atheist, I still wear my yarmulke, as it keeps my brain warm.
Hello, listening people.
Hello.
Hello, Bartek. How are you doing?
Good, mate. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. I was thinking of opening up this episode by doing a Dear Listening People. It is I, Ryan Slawinski of Spit and Polish Presents, and I'm writing to you right now, sitting next to my good dear friend and co-host Bartek. He says he's doing well. But then I didn't do that.
Meanwhile, I'm like, this is an Australian film. I'll say mate.
I'll say...
in an awkward accent that's not mine.
Oh, interesting. But... there's a lot to be said, a lot to be done. We are no longer in the era of the Olympics as we record this. It's over now. And Poland only won one gold.
The climbing one.
Speed climbing. They're really good at climbing fast, those Poles.
No, they're good at climbing and they want to get it over with.
They're getting it over with.
Yeah, so that's speed climbing.
That's speed climbing. We are not an Olympics podcast. We are a film podcast, and we're called Spit and Polish because we're spitting young gentlemen, and we both happen to be Polish. And we talk about movies that are recommended on this program in particular. We go over a film that has come from someone in particular. Perhaps one week it's Bartek, and then, maybe we're doing an episode and you recommended the movie, listening people, or this time round it was I that recommended the film. And we like to do that pattern. We never know who is going to suggest a movie, like what the movie will be that is suggested by the person. Perhaps Bartek will throw us for a loop and say a film both of us have seen or neither of us have seen, or maybe I'll give us an animated movie, or you, the listening people, give us a movie that's just fresh from the cinema. Who knows?
Ryan, you said that's the pattern, but you listed it in the order of 1, 3, 2.
I know.
You're naughty.
I'm being chaotic.
Naughty.
I'm being chaotic.
You're implying that it's my pick next, but it's not.
It's the listening people's. That's right. You, the listening people, can recommend movies. Please do so. We need more on our list. You can
say the Oliver quote.
Which Oliver quote?
Please,
more.
Sir, I want some more.
Please, sir, I want more. More.
And listening people, you have to say the more line.
More. And we've already done Oliver, so you can't recommend that.
Well,
we've already done it.
Yeah, we'll do the Oliver Stone version.
Did it Oliver? I wish. It's just Snowden. But did he do Snowden? I think so.
I think so, yeah. I talked about how I accidentally bought the DVD of that one, wanting the 60s one.
Oh, man. So, we are going to be talking about an animated film that I selected. It is called Mary and Max. It is from 2009. It is an Australian stop-motion animated film. It is from Adam Elliott, whose previous work before this was a short film called Harvey Crumpet, which was a very, very popular film when it came out, a very successful
Polish
piece.
main character.
Yep, and there's so much going on, but this is Adam Elliott's feature film debut, and oddly enough, this has been on my list for a while, Mary and Max, but they are actually coming out with a new movie later this year. Adam Elliott, that's, again, stop-motion animated style. It has this look, it has this feel, it has a bunch of Australian actors spread throughout it, and it involves snails as well. So the snail imagery that is present in Mary and Max will be even more present in the upcoming one.
The Polish word for snail is ślimak.
Oh, is that right? And what's the Polish words for Mary and Max?
My stepbrother Maciek goes by Max down here, so we could make it maybe Marilla and Maciek or Maciej.
Okay. Interesting. And
fun fact, Harvey Crumpet in his dad's name was Maciek in that film. I told that to my Maciek.
So, Mary and Max, we are going to be talking about in depth, but to describe it simply for those who need a bit of a reminder or to be sold on it, it's a tale about two people who find friendship through long distance, through being pen pals. One being a young girl, Mary, and the other being an older man, Max. Mary is an Australian, Max is an American, and it's set in the 70s and goes through the time between then and I guess roughly now. And it's not a children's film. I want to make that clear because some people may look at this and like go, "Oh, it has the claymation look. Surely I can watch this with..." No, don't do it.
Yeah, go to the cinema with Ryan to see Isle of Dogs.
This is a very mature film. It's a dark comedy, very dark.
It's very real.
It's got a lot of heaviness to it, and I have recommended this because I've wanted to watch it for pretty much since it came out. I never got around to it. I loved Harvey Crumpet. I have such an affinity towards that movie, but I rarely watch it because, just like with Mary and Max, it's depressing, but also uplifting and melancholic and bittersweet, and there's a lot of emotions wrapped up in that, which is a 26-minute long story for Harvey Crumpet. So the idea of a feature length from the same people who did that was always appealing but also daunting because I'm like, I don't know if I could handle that for 90 minutes. And that's saying a lot because I love Harvey Crumpet. When one of the first times I came down to Melbourne, there was an exhibition in the city where they had the
Oscar that he won, right?
The Oscar that he won, and
Yeah.
one of the Harvey Crumpets, one of the props, one of the molds, one of the little guys. And I was like so happy. I'm like, look, it's Harvey. I was so happy. I had this smile on my face just seeing one of the Harvey Crumpets in person. I'm like, look, it's him. But I never got around to Mary and Max. It just never happened. And time marches on. And I thought, well, we better bring it on the podcast. My wife apparently has seen it many times over. And
Mary and Max?
Yep, Mary and Max.
Okay.
And she's like, oh, I think you'll enjoy it. But did I enjoy it? We'll have to find out. Bartek, what about you? Are you familiar with Mary and Max? Have you watched this? Evidently, you're familiar with Harvey Crumpet.
Yeah, I haven't seen Mary and Max before. Don't even know if I'd heard of it. I have seen Harvey Crumpet once before at university. Not our drama degree, but the teaching degree I did. So that was probably like 2015, 2016. It was part of, because in Victoria, when you do teaching degree, you focus on like two main subjects that you'll specialize in when you become a teacher. And my two are drama education, obviously, and media studies. And for the teaching course that I did, there were 2 units each of, drama education and media education. And for the media education class, for one of them, we looked at a couple of, different examples of things that you can teach, and they brought up Adam Elliott and Harvey Crumpet. And because Harvey Crumpet is, short film, like you just said, like 22 minutes, we actually watched it in class that day. So, I walked into uni that day, learnt about this guy I'd never heard of, and watched Harvey Crumpet, and then went home, and I was like, hey, Mum, I just watched this thing called Harvey Crumpet, sent her the YouTube link, and then she watched it like a day or two later.
It's impressive, to say the least. The animation and the style of it, the stop motion, the character designs, the color palette of Adam Elliott's style. It's one of those things in which you see a picture of his work and oh, it's a Harvey Crumpet guy. You know immediately. Like, I saw a trailer for that new film of theirs, Memoir of a Snail, and I had no idea this was coming out. I knew nothing, and I saw just an image of an animal in it, and I was like, oh, that's got to be the Harvey Crumpet guy. That's got to be the Harvey Crumpet, and it is. And I was so thrilled because as you would imagine, these take time
Yeah,
to
of course.
make and do.
I think there was a
and
trivia point that this film was made in like 57 weeks with like hundreds of sets and stuff. It was like, wow.
And he hasn't made a thing even short since 2015 when you were doing that. So this new one, it's been basically a decade.
Yeah.
But
Before when
even longer in terms of a feature length follow up since Mary and Max is 2009.
Yeah,
So
just a quick wrap up on the Harvey Crumpet thing. Like I remember thinking back on it, like that is like an epic that like tells you the story of this whole guy's life. And I remember like so many details and you know, it just feels like it lasted so long. And then like a couple of years ago when I looked up something about it, saw it was only 22 minutes long. I was like, was it really that short? It felt like I was sitting there for like 2 hours or something.
And that's a piece of praise because
I could not believe that it was only 22 minutes.
it makes it so that when you watch other things that waste their storytelling time and they have double the amount of it, it makes it more infuriating because it's like, well, you can tell a story
It's like
in
sextuple the amount of time.
You can tell a compact story and make it effective. Mary and Max, I went in expecting a few things. I didn't really know the plot of it. I knew the two characters. One was a little girl, one was an older guy. I didn't know that there was a pen pal situation going on. I didn't know it was in the past. I really didn't know much about it. It was quite the experience, but I did know tonally what to expect because of Adam Elliott's previous works. I've also seen some of his other shorts. He has a very Australian sense of humor, which is crass and crude and talks openly about like poop and farts and having joy of characters misunderstanding things, but having that that certain Aussie optimistic view of it, such as Mary's ongoing, for a while, belief that her next door neighbor suffers from homophobia instead of agoraphobia, and it made me think of agoraphobia, and it made me think of stuff in The Castle, for instance, where there's a lot of that, where it's like these good-natured people, they're not the smartest in the world, but they mean well. And
she goes into a lot of details about, like, you know, tales that adults will tell children, like where babies come from and things like that.
And that even carries on some of that as she becomes an adult. And that's a great contrast to Max, who's a very American character, who's very detail-orientated, and he has his own little hiccups along the way with that. But I knew tonally kind of what to expect, but even then, there's something about the presentation of it, because although I say this isn't for kids, and the character designs are overtly grotesque in a lot of ways, there's still something.
There's a sweetness.
There's still something about having these little claymation-y guys that makes you go, oh, you know, I think about Wallace and Gromit and Aardman stuff, and I'm like, oh, you know, it'll be nice. And so when the movie does do truly upsetting things, it hits harder in a weird way, because my brain is kind of conditioned to like feel an extra level of protectiveness and sweetness over these particular characters because of what they're physically made of in the production. I'm like, oh, because when I grew up, and I don't know, it's similar for you, but like stop motion and claymation stuff were very much like a thing that was around.
Yeah,
you had
like Pingu
and all the Aardman stuff, Chicken Run and Shaun the Sheep and
Wallace
and Gromit.
A show called The Trapdoor, I think it was called.
That and you know, Rocking the Dodos. There was a whole bunch of those around, and even if they were grotesque and violent and creepy, like Wallace and Gromit could be scary, there's still this sense of like, well, it's
they
comfy.
look so squishy.
And it's comfy and it's tactile. Like, you respect it, even as a kid, because you know it's real, but how did they make it like this?
Yeah, it's magic.
It's like you playing with Play-Doh or clay, and it's like becoming a thing that your childhood imagination thinks of when you play with those things.
There are some Yiddish sorcerers off the side making them into little golems that do things.
Yeah, and so I was still taken aback by how unflinching Mary and Max was. What about yourself? You said you didn't know about this film. You didn't know its existence,
No,
really.
I did some light Googling about it like 2 days ago while I was in a quiet moment at work. Fun fact, I was looking up something about Adam Elliott because I remember they gave me a basic, bio of him back in that university lesson, but I couldn't remember too much about him. I remember that he was gay, and that he had a very Australian sensibility about him. I went onto his Wikipedia page, like, he was born in Berwick, Victoria, and I was literally in Berwick as I was reading that, so I was like, oh, he was born around here.
Oh, it's very Melbourne-centric, this film.
Listen, people, I'm pointing in a certain direction. The Mary side of this film is a couple of kilometers that way.
You live closer.
It's
to
like
where
between
Mary
the
was.
two of us.
It's between the two of
like
us.
the bus that I catch is like orbiting around Mount Waverley.
It's hilarious because her address is a fictional address, of course, and it's a play on words, but there is a Lamington Drive in Melbourne.
It probably must be, yeah.
There is. I think it's like in St Kilda or somewhere like that, or somewhere closer to the city, but it's very humorous.
Yeah, whenever I hang out at Ryan's place with our friend Wet Wild Will, sometimes his parents will pick him up and like drop me off home, and the route that they take is through Mount Waverley.
Yeah, and it was very nice, but tell us a bit about your experiences with Mary and Max.
Yeah, I figured it would also be, a very hard-hitting kind of film like Harvey Crumpet. And when I looked it up, I did read that it was about, like, pen pals, but I didn't read about, how it fully progresses. Like, I thought, oh, maybe, she'll grow up and they'll meet up or something like that. I didn't realize that the whole film, until, the ending, would be them in separate places and only communicating through letters and not even all the time. So it was interesting to see how they were developing without that close interaction. And I really liked the touch of, this film is in black and white, but like the Mary section's sepia, while the New York stuff is, with Max, is like film noir-y black and white.
Yeah.
Gave it very different feels.
With slight color that it bleeds in and is emphasized, the red and
brown, the brown birthmark.
And golden sunshine light every now and then, and there's the two different worlds, but devoid of color for the most part.
Was Harvey Crumpet black and white as well?
I remember it kind of being brown,
and
maybe some black and white. It's very similar to this, though.
Tonally, it feels like it would be black and white, but I just can't remember.
And character design-wise, very much the same. I enjoyed this. I liked this very much. I watched this morning.
I watched it last night.
And the way to describe it is a day ruiner. And I mean that as a strength to it because it is tough. It is challenging. It is the embodiment of bittersweet. It's saying something. It's using the medium of animation to tell stories that are very adult, but it is using the medium to help benefit that story rather than it is just happening to be animation as well. You could tell this through live action, and good on you, but there is just something that adds an extra hit to it in the way that it is given to us through this stop motion presentation. And I felt so many emotions during it, positives and negatives, and it's exactly how the film wants it to be. It's a film that is playing you, and it does it masterfully. I was thinking back about what was the last movie we did on the podcast that gave me such a such a range of emotions, and all of them strongly in this way. And I couldn't immediately conjure any up because if I did have them, they weren't in the same way Mary and Max was done. And that's just something about, again, Adam Elliott, not just in his visual style, but there's just something about the mentality he captures, even in a short, let alone a feature, that is so specific to what he is about that I can't compare any other movie that makes me sad or happy or whatever it is in the way that Mary and Max did it and how Harvey Crumpet did. Those two, they're a piece. And maybe I've watched films that tackle a lot of similar subject matters and have similar end results. The fact that the movie I think of that I relate this to the most is Tyrannosaur.
Oh, okay. I was
Um,
thinking of a different one, but yeah,
is
that would be one.
mind-boggling, but it's true. But
That one's
again, still very much like I felt the similar things in a similar way, but the
Yeah.
way that Marion Max has it is just so. This is from an individual. Like this is
Yeah.
from the mind of this person who just. This is the art that they have to give us, and I'm in awe of it. I'm just so appreciative that we get to have a Marion Max.
Yeah, your comparison's a bit more apt. My one's very different, but I was thinking of The Nightingale a little bit, just because of the rawness. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's a film that didn't hold its punches, and this film, I feel, also kind of didn't hold its punches, even though it is a little bit light, like the tiniest bit lighter.
Oh, of course.
Bit more lighter, yeah, not the tiniest bit. They're very, very different films.
All very different
Yep.
films. But how did you go with this? Did you like this? Did you enjoy this? Are you a fan? Or what was your overall journey?
I liked it. I like this quite a bit. I'd have to rewatch Harvey Crumpet. I feel like maybe I'm more warmer on that one, but yeah, I really enjoyed this one. It was, yeah, just surprisingly sweet, even while it was being dark. Like, we have our Max character who, a lot of the stuff that you see from him is, what he's physically going through in his day-to-day life. There might be like some quiet observations, but you're just watching this, figure going through his day and, clearly in a downer point in his life. But then when he's typing his letters to Mary and you have like basically minutes upon minutes and minutes and minutes and minutes of monologue, you really start to get who this character is. Like, clearly he's got autism of some kind, and in the middle of the film he discovers
he does.
he does have Asperger's, which I think was discovered like during the events of this film.
Yep.
And you can really see that in his writing, like the way that he points out that he doesn't understand very basic things that seem basic to him but seem alien to others.
Yep. Social cues. The fact that he is
literal minded,
unable to vocalize with words aloud, but when he can communicate via these letters, it's like a tap that's just been turned on and no one's turning it off. It just keeps going and going and going and going. And like with many people on the spectrum, it's like super focused, but then there'll just be these random sudden derailments into some other thing, and then back to what was the laser focus, and you're like, wait, what? And that's kind of humorous in this movie in the first half, because he's talking to like an 8-year-old girl who is very similar, but she's a child.
Yeah,
so that's kind of like why perhaps to a layman who maybe doesn't understand, you're not thinking of, oh, maybe he's got something on spectrum other than he's neurotic or he's just socially awkward, because, well, there's comedy being played about how maybe he is talking too adult to her, and then he's like, well, maybe I have to child it up by asking, can you do this thing?
Yeah, that's basically what I've been trying to say. Like, it's got the pendulum of like, oh, there are some times where due to his personality and, the way that his mind works, there are things that he says that are quite appropriate and probably helpful talking to a child, but then you have him talking about like condoms and prostitutes and stuff. It's like, oh, no, Max, don't say those things to a little girl. It's, very funny, but also sweet. It's, that's that pendulum that just keeps coming back to.
There's a nostalgia in this. This is the first time I've watched it, but having watched Harvey Crumpet myself at a very young age, I'm brought back to that time where there was this excitement of having animation be able to tell like these really funny but really mature stories. I think we've all had some piece of media, and we've covered some on our podcast that have meant something to us, where you were a child and it was touching upon something a little bit beyond the age range you were, and it was exciting. It was like exhilarating to have like a movie or a show or book or whatever it is that you're getting into as, say, like a 10-year-old, and you're like, well, this is actually kind of verging on subjects that are a bit beyond my age range, but I feel like I'm ready for those things. And that's what I felt with Harvey Crumpet when I saw it as a young boy. I'm like, wow, this is getting into a lot of stuff, but I felt like I got it. And I say nostalgia because not just for Harvey Crumpet, but there's just something about there's a comfiness to Mary and Max, even though it's devoid of colors and these grotesque character designs, because there's such a authenticity to the presentation. Like the opening of this movie is a lot of Australian suburbia. Here's a post, like here's how the mail is being delivered, and here's a window, and here's a garden gnome, and here's this, and even still to this day, you're like, oh, I've seen that, or well, that makes sense, or like someone's post box was a Ned Kelly looking thing, like, oh yeah, and there's just something
just
kind
the
of
Ozpost red letterbox. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, I see those all the time, and now seeing it on the screen, it's like, oh wow.
And although I didn't grow up in Melbourne,
There's more Victorian.
oh yeah, no, I meant to go to my further point.
Oh, sorry.
Although I didn't grow up in Melbourne, when it did hit to be like Mount Waverley, I'm like, oh my god, like I felt like this pain, like this ping of like, oh, childhood in a weird way, even though I didn't grow up here, and I think that's amplified in a weird way because of like Barry Humphrey's delivery throughout all of it. His his narration, because we have a narrator, so the film is primarily told through through narrations.
Yeah.
Narrations of the letters from Mary and Max, respectively, and this connective tissue of Barry Humphries narrating. Barry Humphries is the actor. He is just an omniscient narrator. He's not a character in the film. He's just here to tell you what's going on in between these letters and what's going on with the characters and give us some extra stuff. But he has not only just that actor had such a strength and legacy here in Australia with Dame Edna and other things, but his narration itself, the way he delivers it, there's just like this constant fondness for the details of just like, there's never a sense of cynicism. There's never a sense of like winking at you being like, well, that silly detail that Mary believes is in fact silly, right? There's always just this sense of like, he's telling you this and is like, isn't this amazing?
Yeah.
Isn't this amazing that she thinks this? Or like, isn't this amazing like that, Max, yeah, he has depression, but look at him go. Like there's just constant sense of positivity.
He's not reading from a script. It's like you're looking at the events of this film and he's like off to the side next to you, just like, giving you extra details.
And that's kind of the thing that really pushes this sense of like nostalgia for me, of like a time I didn't grow up in and a place I didn't grow up in with characters I wasn't like at all or I'm not like at all. It's really helped by this retrospective, nostalgic monologuing and narration from Barry Humphries talking to us. And I don't know if you had any of that kind of, with a movie that's very heavy, that kind of looking back in the past or nostalgia or fuzziness and warmth and sense of like, oh, I understand, like that's a sense of comfort to it. But I did. I felt that very much.
I did too. And I remember that was also a very big strength of Harvey Crumpet, where we had Jeffrey Rush doing the same thing. And that film, I think, had even less dialogue from characters. So it was like, the main character was almost this narrator just telling us about the actual events. Yeah, and there's also the extra element of, we cover most of the films we cover on this podcast are not Australian. So when we do cover one that is Australian, it does feel a bit more familiar. And just seeing, the suburban life, like, oh, whenever you don't have one of the three characters we just mentioned talking, you have like short bits of dialogue from the actual characters themselves. And it's like, oh, wow, they're speaking in voices and accents that we hear every day. Like we have a Greek WOG character who just speaks very normally. It's Eric Bana.
Yep. And the fact that he lives in Mount Waverley, if you're local, you're like, well, yes, of course.
Yeah, very close to Oakley too.
Very close. That area is very Greek heavy. And so you're like, they know. And they know exactly what they're fucking doing.
And him simply saying, hey, Mary, it's like, oh, wow. It's like I'm there.
And there was just this... it's this childlike whimsy, because we're really front loaded with Mary at the start. Like we get a lot of Mary,
yeah,
and she's this little girl, and she's looking at the world with these naive points of view, but there's humor to it, even though some of the stuff is overtly tragic and sad, like her mother being an alcoholic. It's played up for a little bit of a laugh because at the start, because, well, Mary doesn't understand. You know, Mary's making it sound cute.
Yeah, the connection that forms is purely by chance from her spontaneous actions too.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
She opens up a phone book at a post office, reads all these funny American names, randomly, drops her finger on one of them, and it ends up being Max, and she contacts him, and that's how the movie starts. The story.
Yes. I just want to ask, how did you feel about the storytelling method of ping-ponging between these three narrations, and that you could argue this doesn't have much of a quotations plot to the story. It's basically catching up with these characters and how they feel, and for the most part it's being told to you by these letters and by this omniscient narrator. How did you feel about this storytelling method, and did it work for you or not?
That's true. I was expecting there to be the meeting at some point, and then maybe like the letter thing would be maybe either dropped or, would come back near the end when they separate or something like that. The fact that it did keep up the whole time did surprise me, but I was cool with it, I think. It added to the drama because there was a point where it was like 8 months between letters and things had changed so much. And it seemed like, okay, where's the film going to go from here? But then when the letters started up again, even though like Mary and Max both seemed like they were done with everything, it just went back to normal. And it felt like, yeah, good, we're back to the letters.
It was comforting to have the pattern again.
Yeah, we had Mary like burn the letters, and it's like, I'm no longer saving up to meet Max. But once she gets another letter, it's like, yay.
And, it's healthy for Max, but the fact was it was unhealthy for Max. It's this...
Yeah, it's both.
It's this horrible cycle for both of them, but also beautiful cycle. I like it. I think you get to experience storytelling in a cinematic lens like this because not only because of the animation existing and kind of dictating like we can just do this the way we want to, but because the film is so confident. It's so confident in itself, because I could easily see a version of this that wants to have those more traditional conflicts of like, oh, Mary and her husband have this thing going on and Max does this, and although those things do happen, it's played so in the background of everything, and what's in the forefront is just getting to know who these people actually are rather than see them motivate plot, motivate drama, motivate some bigger desire to do blank. And you are wanting them to meet. You want them to finally converge. And after a certain point, it's not going to happen until the end of the movie. And I knew very quickly that it's not going to go pleasantly or expectedly in a nice way. I had a sense of where it was going to end, and it did do that. But it wasn't a case of like, well, we were robbed of them actually getting to meet each other, and because it had a purpose.
Yeah.
And it's a risky move, though, to tell a story like this. I think there's one reason I will say that probably this was the choice, because Harvey Crumpet did this too. The narration stuff and like the talking over and like rapid fire going through all of these intricate details of the people. It sure would save time and effort and budget for the animation, because you don't have to do lip movements all the time.
Yeah.
Because that's a pain in the ass, especially for this particular strand of animation. So you write it with that in mind, and so this is how we have it told in this film. To go through the animation, what did you feel about its look, the character designs, the feel of it overall?
You'll probably remember last episode when you brought up that you're picking Mary and Max by the guy that made Harvey Crumpet. one of the immediate questions I asked you, like, oh, does it look the same? And you were like, yep. And I was like really excited about that because, you know, Harvey Crumpet, I remember looking so distinct and so stylistic, and I was so fond of it that I really wanted to see something like it again. And this film delivered on that, especially, you know, it's been a little while since I've seen what Harvey Crumpet looks like, but I looked at Max and I'm like, oh yeah, it was a little bit like this. I was happy to see it again. Very distinct style. Again, like we were saying at the beginning, you know, familiar, very squishy looking, kind of cutesy, even though there is like a, you know, purposeful ugliness to it.
They are likable designs because, as the film talks about, they're not perfect. They're not cutesy. They're not adorable. They're gross and they're kind of rough around the edges, and there's just sickening weird details to some of them, like people have no legs, or this person's ears stick out in this weird way on their head, and the most normal looking person is Mary's eventual husband, played by Eric Bana, and they make a point of
Damien,
like
right?
Damien looks so perfect and normal, and he has a face like as smooth as a spoon, and
he's always got a toothy grin going on.
Yeah, and he stands out because he looks like what a normal film of this animation would be like. But I like how the character designs are in this because it tips its hand of what the film is really all about. It's about these kind of grubby characters, and the humor plays into that. Like, there's a lot of fart jokes and poop jokes and like gross, you know, gross little things in there, but it doesn't tip over into being immature with those things. And I don't know how it manages to do that, but it does. It's just the way that it's done is so overtly funny, but it's also light, and it's like lightly sprinkled there. Like when Barry Humphries says poo, it's funny because he says it with this very posh voice, and there's an element of like, well, yeah, he's saying a silly thing, but he means it, you know?
Yeah, it's funny those tones. Like I remember I mentioned before, you know, in Harvey Crumpet, Jeffrey Rush is the narrator, and he mentions early on that the main character's dad was named Maciek. And I just, because of the name, obviously I remember that line, but like the delivery of that line where it's like, and his father's name was Maciek. And it's like this cutesy, like, oh, how about that kind of thing. And Barry Humphries had that in this as well. Yeah, with, like you said, the poo thing, things like that.
Well, to just bring it a bit to the closeness of us, we are two Australians, so
We are.
Mary and Max is an Australian film. It's set in Australia in part, and we have Australian actors and talent, and so there is a bit of a thrill out of seeing ourselves represented on the screen. There is a bit of a fondness and a closeness that we would get more than, say, other people would.
Similar to The Castle, yeah.
Similar to The Castle, but then we also have the American side of this story in which we are not from New York. We understand media's representation of New York and even Jewish people, and this film, in a way, does what it is doing for Australia, but for the American side. But it's like going into these hyper-specific details.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, yeah, the Mary stuff, you know, all the sepia tone stuff, that's the stuff that's more familiar to us. But then, like, the New York stuff, a lot of that's also familiar because it's just very common imagery in a lot of, like, the Hollywood stuff we watch. Like, oh, New York. I've played video games that have open world New York settings. I've watched films set in New York. You know, oh, there's that building that I've seen in a million things. Oh, there's Central Park. Oh, there's like a New York street that I've seen in a million things. So it's almost like a familiarity, but in like a very secondary sense.
But because Max has such hyperfixations, it feels much more personal and translatable to people who have not been to New York, and goes beyond those things you mentioned of like, we understand New York because it's been represented in so many things, with Max being so hyper focused and specific about like the cigarette butts and how people react to one another and being Jewish and the homeless and all of these things, and his psychiatrist and the dentist and the old lady, and And it's very much like how Mary's story is presented, where, yeah, we get those kicks out of it being like, yeah, I know what these things are, I know that suburb. But with Max, it's also done in the same way where I don't know any of these things from personal experiences, but the movie is handling it in a way as equal as it is with Mary, where I do know from personal experience, but at the end of the day, I feel like both sides of it were represented as equally and as fairly and as authentically as one another.
Absolutely, yeah. You see both of their homes. You see what it's like immediately outside their homes on the street. They both have an elderly neighbor that they bring up a lot. You see them both shopping. It might be a bit of a stretch, but like you see them go somewhere that they go to on the weekdays. Like for Max, you'll be like the therapist or the Overeaters Anonymous. For Mary, you have a couple of school scenes. Yeah, it's presenting like the same things, but they feel so different, even though they're clearly counterparts of each other.
And I will not lie that there is just something unique about seeing Australia in an animated form.
That's a
I
good
don't
point.
think of Australia being shown in animation, if not in such an amount, maybe in a passing little bit of like, oh, some anime will have a shot of Flinders Station, but it's not the same as like, I'm watching an animated film and they know what it, like, here's a cherry ripe. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
fuck me.
A
I've never seen
Lamington.
Lamingtons and
That weird like cupcake thing I don't know the name
yeah,
of.
and
Yeah.
you mentioned it like Mount Waverley and like all these real things that are just standard to Australian life, and we see them in Australian movies, but we don't make a lot of animated movies here in Australia. And yes, and when we do, they don't have this style to them. And even then, it's still a thrill when it does happen. When you're like, oh my god, this thing. So to have a film like this, there's just a certain sparkle of being able to look at it and say, I'm here in this movie in some fashion. I have to ask you now, out of the two, which did you enjoy spending time with, Mary or Max, or was it equal for you? Because the movie does keep them very separated in their narrative styles as well, not just physically.
I think I might have to lean more towards the Max sections when he is like narrating his letters, like getting into that character's head for minutes on end, seeing the way he phrases things, identifying exactly why he says those things. Like every time he says something and then ends that sentence with "because this," like typical one would be like, "because my therapist said it would not be polite." Like, oh, yep, I'm seeing exactly. Exactly what's going on with him. Like that's like I've heard autistic people speaking in that similar way. I can see him trying to be gentler here. I can see the direct contrast of how he is while he is writing compared to when he is first reading the letters and going into a panic attack, seeing how there is a negative thing that this does for him, but also that it's a positive outlet once he gets through it. Just, yeah, seeing that complex relationship. And when it comes to, seeing him in his day-to-day life, I see that as, equal appeal with the Mary side of the story.
I was a huge fan of the Mary side of it because I guess I didn't understand how far the film was willing to go.
Yeah.
I didn't know that there would be time jumps. Because it takes a while. Mary's a kid for a good portion, but in the back of my brain, I knew Toni Collette was the voice of Mary. So I'm like, at some point she has to grow up because Toni Collette is not doing the voice of this child.
I saw the cast list and it was like Mary young, this actress, Toni Collette older.
I just knew Toni Collette and Philip Seymour Hoffman. Those were the two actors I knew. I was happy to hear Eric Bana was here. I didn't know too much, and so when it did eventually come to the points where Mary was growing up and she was becoming more sensible and she was having life happen to her and she was outgrowing but also not the relationship she's had with Max, I found that fascinating because there were some things that have remained the same and some things that are no longer the same as when she was a little girl. Like she now understands it's not homophobia that her neighbor suffers from.
Yeah.
And I remember
and
feeling,
that's a subtle change too.
and I remember feeling a little sad in a weird way when that was she said the correct thing that time. I'm like, oh, she's grown up. Like there was that sense of, oh no, things are progressing, but that's not a bad thing. But also, it's a human condition
Yeah, that's life.
where you feel a bit of that melancholy when those things do change. But it's also good, and she. I think it's because Mary, despite it all, is the positive one.
Mm.
When stuff goes bad for her, and she starts to spiral out of control, and she becomes much more like Max in a lot of ways.
And her mum, yeah.
And her mother, especially her mother. The brutality of Mary and Max is on full display, and there was the scene, we all know the scene, I'm probably going to say, but when she was going to commit suicide, and the film fucking went out of its way to be even crueler by having over her belly flash up that she's pregnant, just so you know. It's just this. It was a touch that I'm like, how many people would have the balls to do that? Because it's already, so overwhelming to see this bright, positive, bubbly character who's suffered adversities, but she's come to this wonderful place, and then now she's degraded and turning into her mother. Come to the point in which she wants to end her own life, only to then have the film be like, here's another thing that makes us even sadder. And it wasn't, and I want to get your points of view on this, because I don't know how again, there's so much of how this film handles things where I'm like, I know that this is how I feel about it, but I don't know how they do it. It doesn't feel misery porn. It doesn't feel exploitative. How the film is willing to just keep shitting on these characters and like ruining, like having their lives turn to, ash, and things go badly, and things like the inclusion of that shot where it's like, hey, you, the audience, know she's pregnant as she's going to try and kill herself. You could say that and it sounds like, well, that sounds like miserable for the sake of juicy drama, but I don't feel like the kind of more serious elements of the movie were done just because that's what you put into a story for, the sake of it.
There are, branches of hope here. Like when she's in that suicidal state, it's been a little while since she'd heard from Max because they're having, a bit of a falling out after his last letter, basically decrying what she did to upset him, which we'll go into in a bit. But also during this sequence, like a package is coming for her and it is at the door, and it's just like, oh, if we just get one thing that brings her to the door, everything will be fine. Just like hope for that one thing. It's giving you hope, even while, very artistic and depressing things are happening.
That's it. There is hope here. That's paired with the misery, the sadness. It's not just miserable. There's so much joy and exuberance and lust for life, and the idea that things do get better, but also the truth of the matter is that life isn't always like that, and life can be, ups and downs. Hence, again, I thought about Tyrannosaur, where Tyrannosaur did the same style of thing, where it's like, it's such a heavy movie, such a downer, but then it also would come in with like these really nice, sweet, tender moments that would take you not just off guard, but like at ease as well, because you need the release. I think that movie's still heavier, but...
Oh, it is, for sure.
I don't know, man, this movie was really heavy. I just felt so like emotionally battered after it, but in a way that is intended rather than just exploitative or manipulative.
I think some of its lighthearted elements do carry over for me a bit more. Like the ending scene, like to just lay it out there, is Mary finally goes to New York. She goes to Max's building. She goes up the lift. She finds the door. She knocks on it. No answer. She opens the door and she, finds that Max has passed away. And it is just an immediate, very, sad moment of, these characters are finally together, but she was just too late to have a proper interaction. And
She has a baby too.
she has a baby with her, yep. And
That's
she's
this bright color in the gray.
and she's very sad about that. But then, like, once the film starts putting something a little bit more uplifting in that scene, it kind of just goes up and up from there. Like, she sees the wall of all the letters that have been, ironed and laminated, and she feels happy. She sits next to him, puts her hand on his hand, and he's smiling in his, dead state, looking up, and it feels really triumphant, even that first time you see it. But then you get that high angle shot that goes up, and
The music's swelling.
Music's swelling, and you can really just see front on his happy face, and Mary's also happy, and it's like, I left the film with that happiness.
Although he died physically alone, outside of his pets, he didn't die alone because he's looking up at what was important to him, his one and only friend, Mary, which is represented through the letters that he has kept all of.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of it. And, even seeing, like, throughout all of this, he kept the little drawing that she did of herself in the mirror. Yeah. And, yeah, it was just... And you're right, like, it is that, but, at the same time, it depends your mood when you watch a film, too, like, how much of one element you take away more than the other. Like, yes, I recognize the positive things, and I'm saying it definitely is a movie that is, challenging you, it is confronting you, but when those sad moments hit, they really fucking hit for me, and the happy moments really hit for me, too. One moment that was one that just is still lingering with me. Weirdly enough, we talked about last time Rashomon,
yes.
Right? And I talked about how there was that shot that I found really haunting of when they found when the woodcutter found the dead body, and there's just the all you see of the dead body is these frozen, rigor mortis hands, and like the fingers all crunched up, and just like this really weird image. I had that with Max when he was choking the homeless guy and lifting him up, and you're getting something you didn't get a lot. One, a POV shot in this movie. You don't get many of those, and the fluidity of the camera movement as he's lifting this guy up and moving him around, and the sound is drowning out, and you just hear through the deafening silence, "Sorry," from the homeless man, and it was just this moment that, it's probably the thing of the movie that I'll be thinking of for the longest time. That was
really powerful for me too.
Powerful, that, like, this movie has lots of powerful moments. Like I mentioned, Mary's a suicide attempt, and, Max has a lot of things going on, but that one there just...
He has like a little bit of an emotional connection with this, like, almost nothing of a character.
It's also an acknowledgement of Max just wants someone to say, "I'm sorry." In this moment, and he realizes he's already had that.
Yeah.
Mary's already said, "I'm sorry," and he hasn't acknowledged it. Because Max just wanted to keep being angry. Was
that after he received the cane?
Yes, because then he goes back and he has it, and he puts it on his, and he's laying with it, and he's like, he already had it, but he hadn't done anything with any of the acknowledgement. He just left it to keep festering. And then when this homeless person says, I'm sorry," it means something now for him. It broke through the barrier that he had for himself. It's boy, what a film! What a film! Like, what is something that you want to discuss, go over, mention, talk about? You said there was one or two things as we've been discussing, like, we'll come back to that or bring that up. But is there anything you want to?
You hit the sorry scene. Was there anything else? I feel like we've really hit all the big points.
What about what divided them?
Right.
It seemed like you had thoughts on that in particular, of what pissed him off.
Yeah. So Mary, she becomes an adult as the film goes on, and she goes to university. I think psychology was the thing that she studied. And it was obviously inspired by her relationship with Max as her pen pal. There was even a trivia point that mentioned that Adam Elliott, the director and creator, had a pen pal, and that this Max character was kind of inspired by that. Um, and, you know, she also learns about Asperger's and writes up a thesis about it and tries to make a book that's um, all about Max, kind of. I think it was like
As a picture of him.
Yeah, picture of him on the cover that he'd sent her, and a lot of the phrasing that we hear about the book is like, oh, you know, one day there'll be a cure for Asperger's, and that directly conflicts with some of the things that Max himself was saying about how, like, I don't think this is a problem. This is who I am. I'm actually quite proud of it. So it was, you know, very obvious there that
Getting to know who he was the thing
Yeah.
that made him happy about this diagnosis, rather than, oh no, I've got a problem to solve.
yeah, and so you could see even before his reaction, like, oh no, there's going to be a bit of a conflict there.
What do you feel about that in terms of just the narrative, but also real world?
It just I didn't really have too much to say, but thinking about it now, yeah, just sometimes even when you really understand a person, sometimes you will just slip up in your phrasing or a misguided attempt to connect to them, and it can just, if not ruin things, at least kind of sour things a little bit. And yeah, the power that you have in saying sorry is very significant. We're now getting into something that we talked about the last time I was on Yum Yum.
Yeah, it's my podcast, Yum Yum
Yeah,
Podcast.
when we were doing Babylon 5, and we did the episode that I was on last had a very major instance of a character apologizing after like 5 seasons of conflict, and how that act alone is really significant. And yeah, I hadn't thought about this until you asked me just now, but that's happening in this as well.
There's a lot to take in with it, because at first you're upset that Max is getting so angry. Maybe there's an overreaction here. Oh no, it's going to make it so that they don't meet each other. But he's right. He's completely right
He is.
to be angry, because this was something that was personal, and now she's made it a stage for everyone to look at and gawk at, because it's not like he gave her permission to use him
Yeah,
as
actually,
a thing. And then even then, it's what we were just saying of, you go that step further of, it's about the difference of the understanding of who he is and the condition he has, because she very much frames it as, one day we'll be able to cure it and fix it. And leads to another great scene, which is Damien leaves.
yeah.
And he has this monologue where he tells her, and Eric Bana, for the little amount he is given in this movie, he is so fucking good. I always forget how great of an actor Eric Bana is. But he has this like really impassioned, and I don't know, I could just tell, maybe because I've been audio editing for so long, like Eric Bana is so close to the mic when he delivers this plea to her of like, Mary, you need to understand that you can't just be like this like ointment cure for every person that's like mentally unwell in the world just because you feel like you need to do that. Like you are hoping to fix everyone else so that you can, you know, fix yourself in a way. You actually have to worry about yourself. You actually have to deal with yourself, which then ties into like one of the moments in the movie too, where there's the whole little like heart candy that says love yourself first.
Yeah.
Or whatever the exact phrase is. And then that's given to Mary. And there's a lot of that conversation about like, Mary, you are taking your own traumas, your own displeasure of yourself, and spinning it into this holy cause crusade, but in a way you're insulting others. Take a moment to actually look after yourself. And I think that's really interesting. Like, it's a really interesting conflict. And then you can have a discussion in the real world about like, you know, we're talking about like representation of Australians, but the representation that this movie has about, you know, autism and Asperger's and all of that is really well done. For, you know, like it's not condescending, and it's not afraid to be uncomfortable with it and just say like, people, like you mentioned, people mean well, but in so doing can kind of in this case with people on the spectrum, kind of push them away further because
innocently hurt them.
Because, well, they don't understand. They think it's a problem that has to be solved. It's a problem it's something to be fixed rather than just acknowledging that it is a part of who this person is. You often see that be a conversation piece about, disability representation and things like that, where, there's this kind of narrative of like, well, you have to fix them so that way they can be happy. It's like, well, Max is happy with this part of himself. He has problems that come about with it. It's not denying that there are issues that he has problems with, but it helped him understand where those things came from.
As dark as everything is in his life, like that is something that he can actually say he's happy with.
It made him bring back something from his childhood that he repressed, but was brought back because of Mary's communication, which was he used to have the little book with people's facial expressions that he could read to understand.
Yeah.
That was one of the traumatic memories that he had, that, his mother slapped him and all that. And then by the end of the movie, that's like one of the prominent things you see him wearing when he's dead. It's like the little book with the faces and all of that. And like, it came back. He realized that was something that helped my condition. I should actually bring that back. I don't care what people think about that because I need that. Like how he has the helmet and people laugh at him with the helmet. He's like, I don't care. It's how it comforts me. It makes me feel good.
His two big props. There's the little book and the pom-pom on his yarmulke.
Yeah. I had a great time. Great time. It's hard to say, but how do you feel about the ending of it all? You've already kind of touched upon it, but were you expecting it to go the way it was? Were you wanting or needing throughout the movie for them to unite? Because there was also a tease of, he mentions, or a visual representation of their crossroads meeting at a certain point when he was talking about
and he was describing the quality of the footpath. I guess through a lot of it, especially early on when she was a child, like there was a sense of like, oh yeah, I would like to see these characters meet. But as it went on, we didn't really see too many, conversational interactions with Max and other people. There were some, like with the therapists and all that, where it was like telling you that there was a conversation happening here, but I just didn't know, like, would Max actually be able to properly have the conversation that he wants to have, in a face-to-face interaction? It made me think sometimes about how, like, I did this a couple of weeks ago, even on Facebook, chatting to you. I finished reading a manga, and I wrote up like a decently little wall of text, like kind of summarizing a lot of my thoughts about it. And I compare that to sometimes when we meet up and you ask like, oh, so you've been watching or reading anything? And like, I'll be like, oh yeah, I did, watch or read this thing. And I'm like kind of struggling to get my thoughts out there. I'm like, I can do it a lot more effectively just by sitting down, typing up a little thing and like putting all the thoughts out there and maybe expanding on it a bit more there. So it kind of reminded me of Max in that kind of thing where it's like, maybe he's more comfortable doing it the way that he's been doing it the whole way. And maybe a meeting might, not be as good as, what I would hope for.
And this is the power of a movie in which perhaps you don't strictly relate or you are one-to-one or whatever with the characters involved, but it makes you understand enough to be able to relate parts of yourself to these things, like...
Yeah.
Another film I would say that we've covered on the podcast that was reminiscent of this, very different, of course, but just talking about characters who have disabilities but try to get on in the world and people around them mean well, but they hurt them, was, what was that anime? I always forget the name of the anime about the deaf girl.
Oh, A Silent Voice?
A Silent Voice with the bully, and then they become in their relationship. I thought about that at points of this where there was a heartbreak in which the conflict was happening because two people who love each other's company or enjoy each other are having a breakdown in communication, and it's around a specific type of disability, and the person who's, in quotations, in the wrong wasn't trying to be harmful, but in so doing, it is getting in the way of their relationship.
We had that a little bit with Josie the Tiger and the Fish as well, earlier this year.
Yeah, so I recommend Mary and Max, everyone. I absolutely loved this. I cannot wait for the next film. I'm hoping to go see it in the cinema. Perhaps we should go together. It
I'd
could
be
a
I'd be
fun-
totally down. What was it called? The Snail?
Oh,
or
yeah,
something?
Memoir of a Snail, I'm
Memoir of
pretty
a
sure.
Snail.
And I don't know anything about it either. I saw like a snippet, like a little teaser, but it didn't give much away other than like, here's a bunch of actors in it, that type of thing. And like,
Yeah.
he is, and with this too, like with Harvey Crumpet, it's small scale. It's across the world, but we only have like two characters you're really focusing on, and everyone else around them is a representation of a thing that they feel rather than like an actual fledged character. Like the one who probably matters the most in Mary's life is her neighbor across the road. He's probably the most important person in her story other than herself. To me, like as a person rather than like a representation of a thing. Like even Damien is like a representation. Well, that guy's like, see, he has his struggles, but he managed to overcome them, but he still has them, that type of thing. Like he's still representation of something, but
I like that.
He was a constant in her life
Yeah.
throughout it all.
I like when he was introduced and the narrator was talking about how like, he struggles to get his name out, so you have to like hit him in the back of the head.
Oh, with Damien?
Yeah, when he's trying to say his last name, which is Papadopoulos, it's like, he gets hit on the back of the head and like the words like physically come out of his mouth.
And you could tell it was you can tell if you know Eric Bana that it's Eric Bana because he was doing his voice that he used to do often.
We talked
like
about
in
that
in
the castle, yeah, where it's
he plays up his Greekness.
He said like a really long word with like emphasis on every syllable. I can't remember what it was, but like disenfranchised or something.
Oh man, Eric Bana is such a great actor. Hollywood didn't know how to use him. That's the shame of it all. We did. Hollywood never figured out how to fully use Eric Bana to his great potential. One day I'll recommend Chopper on the podcast.
I've always been meaning to watch that.
Yeah, it's kind of like the peak of his career in terms of like where he transitioned from what he used to be to what he is now type of thing. It's like the culmination of all of it, kind of like the mix, like the nexus point. But I recommend Mary and Max. Would you?
I do recommend Mary and Max, yeah.
I think it's now time to find out, unless there's anything more you want to say about Mary and Max, find out what the listening people's recommendation is.
Let's hear what it is.
We are doing a film that is relatively recent, a couple of years ago, called Bodies, 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 recommended by Amanda, who is a friend of yours.
Yep, she recommended Children of Men previously on this podcast.
I do not know too much about Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. I don't even know the genre. I kind of know what it looks like because I was seeing movies at the time, and it was one of those where posters were about, and you kind of get like, you look at it, I get a vibe, and there's like one or two actors. I'm like, oh, that actor's in it. Oh, okay, maybe this will be the vibe, but I don't know. I haven't seen it myself, so we'll be covering Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. I'll be wondering why Amanda recommended this while we watch it, because, as you said, Children of Men, I feel is a very different film from what I can tell of Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. So,
I don't know what this film is at all.
No, so we'll
I just typed it up on the list.
Be surprised. So everyone, make sure to check that out. In the meantime, we can be found on your social medias of Facebook and Twitter under Spit and Polish Presents. You can hit us up on there, follow our stuff. You can recommend movies to us, or you can do all of that as well through our email address if you so chose. If you want to talk to us, chat with us, give us movies, you can do it at our email, which is...
I'll say it. Don't worry, Ryan, I'll say it. It's spitandpolished@gmail.com. And I'll say it again for all of you who are digging into your ears and didn't hear it, spitandpolished@gmail.com.
Feel free to rate and review the podcast. All of the information is in the description of the episode. So until next time, listening people, remember to be kind to each other, and remember that this film, it's one of those ones in which you're going to see an elderly homeless man be voiced by the elderly homeless man himself, Molly Meldrum. That was a fucking bizarre credit. I didn't expect Molly Meldrum. He's like an Aussie personality down here. And I was like, holy shit, Molly Meldrum was in this movie? That's crazy.
One big criticism of this film that, Harvey Crumpet nailed and this one didn't. Harvey Crumpet had a really catchy song that's still stuck in my head 9 years later. The God is better than football. God is better than beer.